Part 2. This is a continuation of the story. The link to the first part is in the description of this video. Enjoy watching. The following morning, I awoke to a loud thudding going on somewhere in my head. The inside of my mouth felt like the bottom of a parrot's cage and smelled like a dirty towel. I just about managed to get to the toilet bowl before hitting the floor and hurling the contents of my churning stomach down the white porcelain. My head ached horribly. My poor guts felt as though they had been dredged, and my eyes. Oh God, my eyes. They adamantly refused to focus on anything at all and felt as though they were about to jump out of my skull. All in all, not a great start to the day. Archie, on the other hand, looked absolutely wonderful when I eventually returned to my bedroom after having managed to wash my face and brush my teeth without throwing up again. Dressed in jeans and a white t-shirt, he resembled an older version of James Dean. His hair was combed back and gelled, freshly shaved, and he smelled of an expensive cologne. The only concession to our previous night's drunken debauchery seemed to be the aviator-style sunglasses covering his eyes. "Good morning, my friend," his voice resonated around in my head, his amusement unmistakable as he greeted me with all the cheerfulness of a fresh-faced 6-year-old. "And how are you this fine morning?" I looked at him through the one eye I managed to focus on, its half-open lid struggling to stay awake. "How the hell do you manage to look so normal?" I snapped, falling back onto my bed and moaning loudly. That would be all the practice I get, dear boy. Now get showered and dressed. We have places to go and things to do," he replied, throwing me a large fluffy white towel. "Oh," was all I managed to say before I had to run to the toilet and once again try to settle my stomach. "I'll be waiting for you in the breakfast room," I heard dimly through the closed bathroom door, my head buzzing. Much later, I finally staggered out of the lift and was told by the concierge that Mr. Squires was waiting for me outside. I found my much too cheerful friend sitting in his convertible BMW with the top down and some heavy rock music blaring from the sound system. I gingerly fell into the passenger seat and immediately turned off the radio, much to Archie's amusement. "Stupid lightweight," he chortled as he sped out of the car park, spinning the wheels and sending gravel flying in all directions behind us. "We're going shopping," he declared. "I need new gear," he said, insisting I needed to look like a human being and not some poor, drunken down and out. Despite my frequent protests, he bought me a complete new wardrobe from the most expensive shops he could find. When I tried to complain and tell him he didn't need to do all that for me, he angrily snapped back that he owed everything to me. If it hadn't been for me taking care of him in prison, he probably wouldn't even have been alive, let alone rich and famous. "You're as close as I've ever had to family, so shut the hell up and enjoy it." I turned away to hide the sudden moisture in my eyes and did as I was told. We eventually stopped off at a delightfully old-fashioned country pub for lunch. Actually, it was after 4 p.m., so calling it lunch is stretching it a bit. I was ravenous. I hadn't eaten since dinner the previous night, and what I had eaten then was probably long gone by that time. "Okay, my young friend," my benefactor announced after we had finished eating and were relaxing in the empty pub restaurant. "We need to talk about your future." "What future?" "I'm almost 50, a convicted manslaughterer, no skills I can use, and I've been locked away for the last 20 years. So just what future do I have?" I grumbled in reply. "Exactly. I know you could work for the MCV in London as some sort of hitman or gangster, but you're better than that. Come work with me instead. I need a PA anyway. And just how do you expect me to do that?" I replied. "You travel all over the world, and I can't leave the country until my parole is up in 5 years. Billy's invitation to work for his brothers was actually more of a command, and you know what happens to anyone who disobeys a command from him. By the way, you were convicted of manslaughter, not murder. Just in case you've forgotten." Archie reached into his pocket and pulled out what appeared to be an old, well-used EC passport, tossing it on the table in front of me. I gave up my attempt at arguing about the perception of any future employer regarding the difference between murder and manslaughter and picked up the small red booklet, opening it to find what looked like a picture of me, but with shorter hair and a goatee. "What the hell? How did you get this?" I demanded incredulously, staring at what looked like my genuine passport. "Well, let's just say I like to keep my hand in," he laughed. Have you noticed the name? I examined the document more closely. Oh, very funny. I chuckled at my grinning friend. Well, I thought so, he chortled in reply before rising and announcing he needed to go for a bathroom break. I stared at the passport, knowing it couldn't possibly be genuine. I hadn't had a passport since I was sent down, and there was no way Archie would have been allowed to obtain one for me legally. I had to admit, though, if I hadn't known better, I would have been convinced it was me in the photo. Maybe it could work. Maybe I could use it to get away from the clutches of the criminality I seemed to be heading for. I knew damn well I couldn't leave the country legally because of my parole conditions. But then I snapped out of my thoughts as Archie returned and sat opposite me once more. He enthusiastically asked, "What do you reckon, John Riggs? Shall we travel the world and have some fun?" I took a few moments, staring at the brilliantly forged passport I held in my hand and considering the possibilities of what my mate had just proposed. Eventually, I made the decision that would change my life. Screw it. Let's go for it. Archie jumped up and hugged me, much to the amusement of the overly gay barman, who obviously thought we were part of his lot. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. A few weeks later, we were settled in Archie's villa, a beautiful 4-bedroom place with a large pool situated up in the hills just behind the small upmarket resort of Port Andratx on the southwest corner of the Spanish holiday island of Majorca. It was about 40 minutes by taxi from the airport and the island capital, Palma. Life was great. I had a deep tan, grown a goatee, had my hair cut, and looked exactly like my passport photo. I worked out every day, swam several laps of the pool each morning, and ran at least 15 miles a week in the hills surrounding the villa. All in all, I was as fit as a butcher's dog and looked great, even if I say so myself. Archie wasn't always there. He had commitments to fulfill, commissions to paint, etc. Consequently, as I was still nervous about using the passport he'd forged for me, I was left on my own for days at a time. He liked to keep his villa as removed from his public life as possible, and only a few locals knew he actually lived there. They pretty much kept that to themselves. Archie got on great with all of them, speaking fluent Spanish by then and endearing himself to them with his generosity and his natural ability to win the hearts of anyone who ever met him. When he was there, he would invariably be accompanied by some lovely women he was painting at the time. The sounds of laughter and music would resonate through the villa most nights when Archie was in residence, as he enjoyed entertaining guests. He often left his windows open, perhaps to deliberately tease me as I lay in my lonely bed, frustrated and left to my own devices. More often than not, the lovely women would spend their days lounging around the pool, showcasing their confidence and beauty, leaving me in a constant state of distraction. They displayed no signs of embarrassment or inclination to cover up when I was around. I was sure they were aware of how their presence affected me. Despite those constant displays of beauty around me, I was still shocked beyond belief when, one beautiful sunny morning, I made my way to the pool for my early swim. I was treated to the sight of a stunning blonde woman just emerging from the sparkling water as she pulled herself up onto the side of the pool. By then, I was accustomed to such displays, but this time, much to my astonishment, I recognized her. She was the most famous female American pop icon of the day, constantly featured in papers all over the world. She was probably the most famous person I had ever seen in my life. She grinned at my open-mouthed staring, nonchalantly picked up her towel, and strode past me into the villa, cheerily saying, "Good morning." I continued to gawk at her as she walked away, her confidence evident as she moved gracefully. "Close your mouth, my young friend. You're drooling." I heard Archie's voice from behind the newspaper I hadn't even noticed was there. He was clearly amused by my apparent inability to acknowledge the lady's greeting. "Isn't that?" I stammered, surprised. "Probably," he replied, grinning and turning the page of the paper, trying unsuccessfully to hide his laughter at my starstruck admiration of the famous woman. "But she's—" I managed to exclaim, finally getting my mouth to work again. "Of course she is. We don't want any lines on her when she's modeling for me, do we?" came the reply from the luckiest man in the world. I sat down, my head filled with a million questions as I stared at my friend in open admiration. "Are you and her, you know?" I quizzed, wondering if there was any way I could manage to get rid of the smirking figure in front of me and have my own chance with the beautiful lady. Young John, my naive friend, let me point out that true artists are like doctors. We see the form and shadows we are capturing for posterity. Nudity is not always about attraction, you know, he replied, pulling the newspaper up to cover his shaking shoulders as he laughed silently at my astonishment. She does look amazing, though. He finally stopped laughing when I picked him up and tossed him, fully clothed and with his newspaper, into the deep end of the pool. The villa was looked after by a local couple from Majorca. They lived with their family just down the road in the same old farmhouse the lady had grown up in and inherited from her parents. Both in their 60s, Maria kept the house clean and cooked when she felt we needed a proper meal instead of the rubbish we usually ate. She spoke excellent English and generally acted as our mother hen, even though she wasn't that much older than us. Well, not much older than Archie anyway. Her husband, Jose Alberto, looked after the garden and the pool and took care of the general maintenance of the villa. An avid Real Madrid fan, he didn't speak a word of English, but that didn't stop him from chatting away in Spanish, even though he knew I hardly understood a word he said. Lovely man, though. I had adopted the habit of taking my early morning swim without clothes when I was alone in the villa. It wasn't an exhibitionist thing. It was just so much easier than having to dry my swim shorts every time I swam. I quite frequently slept outside at night too, enjoying the sounds of crickets and other animals going about their nocturnal activities. The quiet stillness of the villa when I was alone there was a welcome change from the hustle and bustle I had become used to in prison. One particularly hot and cloudless day, I had just emerged from the pool, brushing the excess water from my tan body with my hands before using a towel to dry myself properly. I looked up and saw Maria grinning and watching me from the open patio doors. The cheerful older woman didn't even blush. She just laughed at my discomfort as I scrambled to pick up my towel. With a flirtatious grin on her lovely face, she said, "Ah, Senor Juan, if I was not such a good Catholic girl." I finally managed to wrap the towel around my waist to cover myself from her amused gaze. "Maria," I mocked in return, "and if I didn't like your husband so much, you would be with me now." I laughed loudly as she finally had the decency to look embarrassed and blush. She giggled, her beautiful dark brown eyes opening wide as she put her hand to her mouth in mock shock at my joking remark. "I think maybe you need some attention, or maybe you need to, how do you say, get yourself sorted, Senor Juan." The charming mother and grandmother teased me mercilessly, grinning as she nodded toward me. I dried myself and dressed in shorts and a t-shirt before sitting on the sun lounger and picking up the day-old English newspaper that Maria had placed on the floor tiles near a cup of tea she had made for me. Staring off into the pristine blue sky and sipping the hot liquid, I thoughtfully considered what our cheeky housekeeper had teased me about. I really did need to get myself sorted. It had been almost 2 months since my last escapade with the lovely women Jenny and Annie. Not a particularly long time compared to being in jail, but then again, I thought I wasn't actually restricted any longer and was free to seek out as much companionship as I wanted. Maria was off limits, though she may well have been up for it, judging by the warm look she had given me as she watched me around the villa. I really did like her husband, and as the old saying goes, you don't dip into your own backyard. For a single good-looking bloke fast approaching 50, I was probably one of the most inexperienced men you could ever meet. I had known only 2 women, a mother and daughter combination that I recognized was many men's ultimate fantasy, before being locked up for 20 years. During that time, I only occasionally had the willing but not particularly attractive Christine available to release my pent-up feelings. The 2 lovely ladies at the hotel were delightful, but of course, they were there for the money, not because I had charmed them. Consequently, I had no real idea of how to entice willing and attractive women into my life. Yes, I could have tagged along with Archie and enjoyed the attention of the many women who seemed drawn to him, but that wouldn't have been me. I was an independent bloke, not someone who hung on to his famous friend's coattails. When I thought about it, I had never really approached a woman. My ex-wife had approached me when we were kids, and her mother had once seduced me after her daughter left. Christine had been introduced to me by Billy McVeigh in prison, and the 2 hookers had been arranged by my friend Archie. As a relatively normal heterosexual bloke, my track record with women was, to say the least, pathetic. I mentioned all this to Archie one night while he was at the villa for a few days in between trips to talk to people about paintings they wanted to commission. We were relaxing by the side of the pool after enjoying the wonderful Spanish chicken and salad that Maria had left for us. "You need a job," he stated dramatically. "I know just the place. Come on, let's go." He jumped up with far more energy than a man of his age should have had and dragged me out to the car, driving us into town to the restaurant we always frequented. He refused to tell me what we were doing on the way there, telling me to wait and see. Instead of going into the dining area, he strolled next door to the attached pub and walked straight behind the bar, receiving no objection from the owner. He reached up and got the most expensive bottle of brandy from the top shelf, poured us both a generous glass, and sat down at the end of the bar, pulling me onto the stool next to him. After taking a huge gulp of the smooth drink, he announced, "You need to work here." I looked around. The place was buzzing, music blaring from the sound system. There were dozens of customers, mainly women, and many of them were dancing and casting glances our way. "That sounds like it might be fun," I laughed, catching the eye of a particularly attractive middle-aged woman sitting against the back wall with a group of about 4 or 5 other females. She held my gaze for a moment before winking at me, making a bold display of interest. I felt the first stirrings of excitement as I smiled back, then reluctantly turned my attention to Archie. "But what makes you think I could get a job here?" "I've never worked behind a bar in my life," I said, taking a sip of my drink. My highly amused companion slapped me on the back and called down the bar, "Giorgio, have you got a second?" The owner smiled and sauntered over, leaning on the bar between us. "What can I do for you, my friend?" he asked warmly, shaking hands with Archie. "This is my best friend in the whole world, John," Archie said. "John, this is Maria's brother, Giorgio. John would like to work here so he can meet some of the beautiful ladies who frequent your wonderful establishment." "Of course, Archie, not a problem. I hope he's a very fit man," Giorgio replied, both of them bursting into laughter. Archie slapped me on the back again, and Giorgio shook my hand. "Welcome, Senor John. Any friend of Archie is a friend to me." With that, he wandered off again to serve some thirsty customers. "What?" I stammered, amazed by my friend's ability to surprise me. "Idiot," he chuckled. "Didn't you ever wonder why we never had to pay at the restaurant next door? Ever wonder why we always got the best table? Why the chef always came out to chat, no matter how busy they were? I own the whole place, my young friend. It was cheaper buying the restaurant than spending a small fortune every time I came here." As I looked around again, paying more attention to our surroundings this time, I noticed the walls were filled with photos of Archie and Giorgio with happy customers, some of whom were world-famous figures I recognized. Interspersed among the photos were drawings that were obviously Archie's originals, sketches of various customers, some famous, some unknown, all brilliantly done and clearly worth a small fortune based on what I had discovered about the prices of Archie's work. Jesus, is there no end to this? I laughed in open admiration and affection for my friend. When do I start? I had to say, Archie's idea of me working at the bar as a way of meeting willing and available women was definitely one of his top suggestions. The place was continuously busy all summer and beyond, filled with some of the most beautiful women a man could ever hope to meet. Pora Andres was a stunning little cove where millionaires tended to moor their yachts when they wanted somewhere quieter than the marina in Palma. Bar Real was where they all seemed to congregate when they came ashore for a drink. "Why don't you all come up to the villa instead of traveling back to your ship at this late hour?" I suggested tentatively, hoping against hope that at least Josie would agree. "There's plenty of room, and I'm sure we can rustle up something for breakfast in the morning." Thankfully, amidst a lot of ribald comments about whether an old man like me could handle 4 lovely ladies, they agreed to join me for the night. I must admit, the thought of being alone with them was causing me some concern as we traveled the short distance to the villa in a taxi. Surprisingly, it wasn't the idea of having to cope with all of them together that worried me. I was absolutely enthralled by the lovely Josie by then and really wanted to get to know her better. I hoped for some time alone with her, dreaming of her lying next to me in bed. Even in my slightly tipsy state, I felt nervous about how I was going to separate her from her friends. I soon found myself concentrating more and more on the woman I had truly fallen for, falling deeper under her spell every time our eyes met or her hand brushed mine. Happily for me, it didn't turn out to be a problem. As soon as the three younger girls spotted the pool, illuminated by the underwater lights, they immediately jumped into the water, holding hands and screaming with delight as they hit the cold water. They disappeared beneath the surface before emerging once again, laughing and giggling hysterically as they splashed one another and tried to dunk each other. Josie and I both stood laughing at her three slightly drunk companions, watching them continue their playful antics. However, the movement of my left hand on the front of my pants drew Josie's attention and caused her to glance toward me. "Sorry," I muttered, feeling my cheeks blush furiously as I turned away slightly and finished straightening my pants. "Not at all," she laughed. "I'd have been disappointed if it hadn't happened with all the young women around. Very impressive, by the way," she teased, glancing down at my pants before winking at me. I grinned nervously at her before leaning in to kiss her for the first time. The sweet, fruity flavor of the wine she had been drinking transferred to my lips as we playfully teased each other in a kiss that sent a rush of excitement through me. She eventually pulled away, gazing up into my eyes as she pushed gently against my chest with her delicate hands. "By the way," she whispered, nuzzling her lips against my ear, "it's not going to happen." She gave me one last kiss before turning to walk into the villa, glancing back over her shoulder as she walked away. She swayed her hips in a way that drew my attention, her voice playfully teasing, "Not tonight anyway. Not on our first date." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, my initial disappointment tempered by her enticing words. "Oh, so this is our first date then?" I teased, grinning at her like a love-struck teenager. "I do hope so, John. I really do hope so," she replied, smiling at me as her hips swayed alluringly into the villa. The three young women had continued to play, repeatedly jumping in and out of the pool to splash each other while laughing under the star-filled summer sky. They teased Josie and me mercilessly, demanding that we join them in their fun. Josie, however, adamantly refused, laughing as she informed her companions that there was no way she was exposing herself to have me compare her to their much younger, firmer bodies. Despite my loud protests to the contrary, insisting that her beautifully soft figure would stand comparison to anyone's, she maintained her decision to keep her clothes on. Josie also playfully prevented me from joining the girls, telling me firmly as we cuddled together on a sunbed, "I don't want those young ones tempting my new man, not before I have had a chance to be alone with him. So you can keep your pants on too, mister," she laughed, whispering in my ear as I attentively watched the display of beautiful women. Eventually, the girls tired of their playful antics, strolling casually into the villa, dripping water all over Josie and me as they sauntered past. I must admit, if I hadn't been so captivated by the lovely lady wrapped comfortably around me, I might have jumped up to join them. Instead, I devoted my attention to Josie, the wonderful woman I desperately wanted to be with. We talked and talked, feeling completely at ease together, as if we had known each other for years instead of just a few short hours. We shared our life stories. Josie told me how she had married a guitarist when she was young, and they had been in a band together in their late teens and early 20s. She had fallen for him deeply, wanting to settle down and have a family, but he preferred the rock and roll lifestyle and had been unfaithful during their marriage. Eventually, they divorced after he gave her an STD that caused her significant physical and emotional challenges. At that time, the band had split up as well. She had gone on to make a few records but never found major success, instead performing at clubs and pubs in London until a friend suggested she try cruise ships. She had fallen in love with that lifestyle and had been traveling the world ever since. In turn, I shared my own story, not everything, of course. I told her about my disastrous marriage and how my ex-wife's betrayal and vindictive lies had led to me spending 20 years in prison for something I didn't do. I omitted the part about killing my attacker in self-defense and later working for the most notorious villain in the country. Some things are better left unsaid, aren't they? I told her all about Archie, how the villa belonged to him, that he was a world-famous artist who obviously had more money than sense, but also was the best friend a man could ever wish for. She gazed around in wonder at our surroundings, taking in the spectacular view of the beautiful resort below us and out to the moonlit sea beyond. Then she informed me that she must be completely out of the loop, as she had never heard of my friend Archie as an artist and only knew him as the owner of the bar where we met. I laughed loudly, hugging her close while imagining the blow to his ego when I reluctantly told him about her lack of recognition of his talent. Eventually, we dozed off, utterly exhausted and slightly hungover, wrapped in a couple of towels to ward off the pre-dawn chill in the cloudless sky. We huddled together, feeling like our bodies were merged as one. The following morning arrived in a blaze of glorious sunshine, and I found myself still on the sunbed, very much alone and stiff from sleeping on an unpadded surface. I groaned as I picked myself up, my early morning discomfort pressing against my trousers as I wondered if last night had been just a dream. Had I really spent the evening surrounded by lovely women? Looking around, I spotted several items of clothing scattered near the sparkling pool. A couple of pairs of panties and a flimsy white bra reassured my still groggy mind that yes, I had been fortunate to witness the delightful display of beauty and had spent the night with the most wonderful woman I had met in a long time. As the marvelous images began to fade, I started to wonder where everyone had gone. Suddenly, a loud, giggly laugh broke the silence, one I instantly recognized as belonging to a lovely Spanish woman, likely cleaning up any mess we had made the night before. Trying to relieve the stiffness in my body, I stretched my limbs and adjusted my trousers before making my way into the villa, following the sound of raucous laughter coming from the kitchen. There, I found Maria and Josie standing at the stove, preparing a mountain of toast and scrambled eggs, the wonderful aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the room. The joy I felt at seeing the beautiful woman of my dreams standing beside Maria was overwhelming, and it shot through my heart with a force that almost made me dizzy. They were happily chatting away like old friends, sharing cooking duties and giggling as they exchanged some kind of joke at my expense. "Good morning, ladies. Something smells good," I called out. The pair jumped at the unexpected sound of my voice, their shrieks of laughter accompanying the warm smile I received from the blonde woman who had spent the night beside me. She looked as though she had just emerged from a comfortable bed, dressed in one of my t-shirts. She rushed over and hugged me tightly, kissing me lightly on the lips before pulling away, playfully commenting, "Yuck, morning breath." She pushed against me with a teasing smile. "Good morning to you too," I replied, much to the amusement of the watching Maria. "I think Senor Juan should go have a shower. Maybe a cold one?" Maria chimed in with a grin. "Breakfast will be ready when you have, how do you say, taken care of everything?" Josie reluctantly drew apart from me, kissing me softly as our bodies separated. She grabbed my shoulders and turned me gently away, pointing me toward the bedrooms. "Off you go, stud. Do what the lovely lady says. Breakfast will be ready in 10 minutes, she said with a playful tone, her early morning voice filled with warmth. I couldn't help but chuckle as I wandered away, joking about now having 2 women ordering me around when I was almost 50. Over the next few weeks, we spent as much time together as the ship schedule allowed. Every time they were in port, they stayed at the villa. The 3 younger girls had the time of their lives, making full use of the pool and deck to keep their beautiful bodies in shape and nicely tanned. Although Jose Alberto was accustomed to women around the villa when Archie was there, the sight of 3 fabulously fit young girls enjoying the sun led to the garden area being beautifully maintained, much to the chagrin of his wife, who would often admonish him in quick-fire Spanish if he paid too much attention to them. Josie, of course, kept her bikini on, which was always a delightful sight. The 3 younger girls met Archie, and he insisted on painting them. The results were spectacular, showcasing their beauty in a way that was both revealing and subtle. Josie adamantly refused to pose for him, insisting she felt inadequate next to her friends. Instead, Archie painted a facial portrait of her that captured her warmth and zest for life, which I thought was the best painting he had ever produced. It was true that a well-done painting can give the illusion that the eyes follow you around the room, and in this case, Josie's sparkling green eyes seemed to grin at me no matter where I stood or sat, evoking a sense of delight. In those first few weeks, Josie spurned my advances. Our relationship was evolving. We had a wonderful connection, laughing and chatting freely about everything and nothing, much like I had only ever experienced before with my friend Archie. We got to know each other intimately, not physically, although we did share many kisses, but intellectually. We discussed our hopes, fears, and dreams, becoming the best of friends long before we became lovers. I understood her reluctance when she said she wasn't that kind of woman and needed to get to know me better. Instead of making innuendos about her ideas, I consoled myself with the knowledge that I was falling for her and could wait as long as it took to deepen our bond. I never attempted to pursue other women after I first met Josie, resisting the temptations from women in the bar who seemed interested. I was completely taken by her. It was Josie herself who instigated our first intimate moment. Instead of arriving with the other girls one night, she walked into the bar alone, carrying a small overnight bag. I rushed to the end of the bar and embraced her, feeling as though we had been apart for months instead of just 3 weeks. After drawing away from our kiss, she looked up at me lovingly, a mischievous grin sparkling in her eyes. "I'm here for a week, all alone," she whispered. "I do hope you have clean sheets on our bed." "Of course, madam. All the beds have clean linen," I replied, grinning back at her. Suddenly, her words hit me like a bolt of lightning. "Giorgio," I called over my shoulder. "I'll see you in a week or so," I added amid the playful ribbing from the rest of the staff. Josie and I left the bar and hopped into a waiting taxi for the 10-minute journey back to the villa. 15 minutes later, we were kissing our way into my bedroom. "Oh, what about?" I started, but she interrupted with a teasing question. "Do we really need them?" I paused, reflecting on what she had just said. My mind shifted to another concern. "What about, pregnancy? Are you on the pill?" She laughed out loud, her entire body shaking with mirth beneath mine. "Oh my God, John. Just what age do you think I am? My childbearing days are long gone." I realized we had never discussed our ages. It was probably the only thing we hadn't talked about in the previous weeks. I laughed. "Maybe 40 or so? Late 30s, maybe?" "Oh, you darling man. I'm 5'3", she replied, grinning. My mouth dropped open in amazement. She looked years younger than that. I had thought I was older than her, but it turned out she was actually 4 years older than me. For a brief moment, I found it amusing that she was the same age my ex-mother-in-law had been when I was involved with her. I smiled down at Josie. "Well, that's okay then." I laughed, bending down to kiss her. What a week we had. We spent our time talking, laughing, and enjoying each other's company, experiencing a fantastic connection. In between our many moments together, we joked like two love-struck teenagers, often lounging around in the villa, except when the lovely Maria was around. We didn't want to make her jealous. We swam a lot, teasing each other playfully whenever our bodies touched in the cool water. Then we'd lay on a couple of loungers pulled together to create a larger space to dry under the hot sun. I have to admit, even in my fit physical condition, I was nearly exhausted when the time came for us to part once again. Josie had to return to the ship for another 3-week cruise around the Mediterranean, and Archie was due back that weekend, which would curtail our time together. As we lay cuddled together on my bed after one last slow farewell, Josie looked into my eyes and whispered, "Come with me, John." I thought I just did. "Didn't you notice?" I joked, receiving a playful nudge in my ribs as a reward for my humor. "You know what I mean, you silly man," she laughed. "I meant come with me on the ship. I'm sure we can get you a job working in the bars. Just think, we could be doing this every night." That last sentence was enticing. "I'm not sure I can," I murmured nervously, and the look of disappointment on her beautiful face was heartbreaking as she sat up. "Why on earth not? I thought you loved me. Or did you just say that to get close to me?" she snapped moodily. "Firstly, I meant every word. I love you with all my heart, you self-conscious darling. Secondly, I don't have the right papers," I explained. "My passport is false, and my name isn't real. What if someone notices? I could get arrested and sent back to prison for breaking my parole and leaving the country illegally. Oh, please. I bet most of the Eastern European staff on board have false papers, and they don't have any trouble whenever we dock. So why should you?" she argued. "And you said Archie was the best forger in the world. Now get off me and order me a taxi. I have to go think about what I said, and we'll talk about it when I get back," she insisted. "Yes, miss." I laughed, pretending to be subservient. "Whatever you say, you sarcastic a-hole," She giggled over her shoulder as she headed to the bathroom, playfully wiggling as she went. The next 3 weeks felt like an eternity. Archie and I talked many times about the possibility of me leaving the villa and traveling with Josie. We discussed what that would mean for both of us and what might happen if I didn't go with her, how our long-distance relationship might struggle if she met someone else on board. He tried to reassure me, promising that he could arrange any papers I might need without fear of detection by the authorities. I was still skeptical, worried that now I had something to lose. Late one night, as we lay outside by the pool, Archie philosophically asked me, "What would you prefer? The chance of maybe 30 years of happiness with the woman of your dreams, or the faint possibility of another 10 years in prison if things don't work out?" No contest, really. I had already lost 20 years of my life, and I didn't want to spend my next years hiding and only managing to see the woman I loved for a few short days each month. Nope. The decision was made, albeit with a large intake of alcohol to help the process along. I was going with her. Not only that, I was going to ask her to marry me, too. That last announcement met with much laughter and remarks from my drunken friend, as he assured me that he would remember what I had decided the following day, even if I denied all knowledge of it. As it happened, I actually did remember the day after. It was as though a ton of weight had been lifted from my shoulders as I wandered around Palma looking for a ring to buy for my fiancée. All being well, and she accepted. Of course, I didn't have much to spend, having turned down Archie's offer to fund the purchase since he was going to be my best man, whether I liked it or not. But I did manage to find a nice, small one I could afford and hoped she would like it. She did. In fact, she loved it, showering me with affection and tears of joy as she tried her best to embrace me. I thought we were alone when I asked her, only to be surprised by Archie and the girls, Maria, her husband Giorgio, and the rest of the bar staff, all bursting into the lounge, carrying the biggest bottles of champagne I had ever seen. What would you have done if she'd said no? I asked my mate later in the evening, standing at the bar while my new fiancée went around showing off her new ring to any customer who happened to be in front of her. Well, then I would have ordered double the champagne, and we would have drowned our sorrows, he replied, slapping me on the back and assuring me he just knew that would never happen. That was my mate for you. If you win, drink a bottle of champagne. If you lose, drink two. Great philosophy for life. Really. The next couple of months flew by. Josie and I decided we wanted to get married as soon as we could. Neither of us had family, and at our ages, we couldn't see any point in delaying our wedding with a long engagement. So we just wanted to tie our union in the best possible way. Archie got his lawyer in Palma to come to the villa and explain exactly what papers we would need for a civil ceremony conducted by the local mayor. A few short weeks later, my best man presented me with all the authentic-looking documents required by Spanish law. It appeared that I had been born on the island of Guernsey, part of the British Channel Islands, and that I had never been married before. I have to say, the man was brilliant at his job. The papers all looked 100% genuine to anyone who cared to look at them and were certainly good enough to pass the scrutiny they received at the mayor's office. When we booked our wedding, Josie left all the legal arrangements to me and Archie. Well, Archie really, while she carried on working aboard ship. She was as excited as a little puppy when she told me she had arranged for me to start working with her on the ship the next season and that we would have our own cruise cabin just for the two of us. She hadn't been able to wait until she docked again to tell me, and instead had rung the villa, tearfully sobbing down the phone in her happiness as she tried to express just how much it all meant to her and how happy I had made her. Her 3 bridesmaids bought all their required dresses and other essential parts of their outfits when they were in Palma, trusting the best man and me to sort our own suits out, only instructing us that they had to be a pale beige color with a crimson red tie to match her dress and the ones for the girls. Eventually, on a beautiful sunny autumn day in late October, we were married in front of all our friends in the village and many of Josie's friends from the ship. They had all just returned from the last cruise of the season, so instead of Josie going on to work on the winter cruises as she would normally have done, she decided to spend the whole winter with me at the villa, and we would start on the ship again the next spring. I've got to say, Josie looked wonderful, glowing with happiness in a cream silk figure-hugging dress that showed off her light tan to perfection. She bounced around during the ceremony and the after-party, infecting everyone with her overwhelming joy as she celebrated our big day. The three bridesmaids were nothing short of spectacular, too. Their crimson dresses showcased their wonderful figures, and especially their long legs. I think every man and probably a few of the women at the party were admiring the girls as they danced the night away with anyone who managed to drag them onto the small dance floor we had set up. Not me, of course. I only had eyes for my lovely bride as she wandered around chatting with all the guests. I just couldn't believe my luck that such a beautiful, vivacious woman would even give me the time of day, let alone share my life with me. The after-wedding party was at the bar, and for the first time ever, the tills were shut. All the food and drink were provided by Giorgio and Maria and their chefs, and all paid for by my wonderful best man. Incidentally, Archie Squires, internationally famed artist, ex-con, and general party enthusiast, made one of the great best man speeches. He had every one of the guests shedding tears of laughter with his anecdotes about us all before he toasted the bride and groom and presented us with his wedding present. A 2-week safari in Kenya that elicited a squeal of delight from the by then happily tipsy bride. I had also met the man who was about to become my new boss at the wedding. Felix was the bar manager of the ship and about the same age as me. A tall, extremely handsome bloke with a full head of black hair, just beginning to show flecks of gray around his temples. He was very affectionate around Josie, repeatedly hugging and kissing her whenever their paths crossed during the day. I would probably have been a little jealous if he hadn't been as camp as a brigade of scouts and very obviously gay. Lovely man, though. After we had checked into the bridal suite at the poshest hotel on the island, courtesy of the best man, my new bride changed into something comfortable for me. We shared an intimate moment, and I have to say it was the best I had ever experienced. There's something different about being close with someone you truly love. Once we were done, we snuggled lovingly together, wrapped around each other tightly, and swiftly drifted off into a contented sleep, ready for our journey to our honeymoon destination tomorrow. All in all, that whole day was probably the happiest 24 hours of my life. My new wife and I spent a wonderful few months together that winter. We had a marvelous honeymoon in Kenya, enjoying many adventures during the day and spending quality time together every night. So I probably needed the rest when we arrived back at the villa to find that Archie had abandoned the master bedroom for us to occupy. He was away for several weeks painting a minor royal somewhere, I think, so we virtually had the place to ourselves. Maria and Jose Alberto continued to look after the house and gardens despite the fact that Josie had taken to life as a housewife with all the enthusiasm of a freshly married young bride. Cooking especially was something she loved to do. She had always had a talent for it, she told me, but of course didn't have the opportunity on board the ship to practice her skills, so she really enjoyed being let loose in Maria's kitchen. People say there isn't room for two women in one kitchen, but those two got along like a house on fire, teaching each other various skills and different dishes as they laughed and giggled together in their domain. The three lovely bridesmaids stayed with us whenever they had the chance, although not as frequently as they could in summer because of the different cruise schedule they were working to. Christmas came and went, celebrated at the villa with a huge party Archie threw for all the bar and restaurant staff and many of our friends. Maria brought all her family with her, and I must say she enjoyed herself. I had never seen her drunk before. My 50th birthday was celebrated in much the same way in February of the following year. April came along all too soon. Time for us to pack up and start work on the ship, a new experience for me and a chance for Josie to get back to doing what she loved, singing for the public. Archie was home the weekend we set off and drove us down to the docks in Palma, where he exchanged tearful farewells with Josie and a warm hug with me. Probably a bit over the top, I did mention, as we would be back in 3 weeks anyway. That first trip around the coastal cities of Italy was the first time I had been anywhere other than England. In a previous holiday to Barcelona, I loved it. Being able to see all the other cultures and have my lovely wife show me around the ancient cities we visited was absolutely mind-blowing to this inexperienced traveler with my narrow experience of the big wide world. We usually had the chance to look around during the afternoons when we were moored, as we both worked through the late evenings, and so had the daytime free to do whatever we wanted. Josie had seen it all before, of course, but took great delight in showing me everything she could think of that I may have been interested in. There's something very special about being close with someone you truly love. It's just so much more romantic somehow. All too soon, our first cruise together was over, and we were back at the villa. I immediately started babbling to Archie about what we had seen, acting like a kid after his first visit to a zoo. To his credit, he sat there listening to my rambling for at least an hour before I drove him to drink, and we all got merry and jumped into the pool. So began mine and Josie's cycle of life as cruise ship crew. We would be away for 3 to 4 weeks at a time during the summer. Then after we had transferred to the winter cruises that went farther afield than the Med, we were away for sometimes up to 2 months at a time during the darker months of November to March. Sadly, this meant that we were usually away for Christmas and New Year, missing Archie more than I ever thought possible for me to miss any man. The lovely man surprised us with a wonderful revelation the first Christmas we were away from the villa. Instead of dropping us off at the docks, he asked us to take a taxi, as he had somewhere to be. When we arrived at the ship, we found the devious old chap waiting for us with his bags, and amid many tears of joy from my wife, he informed us he had nothing planned for that holiday and thought he might as well join us and have us cater to him, as he was a world-famous artist and listed as a VIP passenger on the ship. Of course, we jokingly told him to go away, but we ended up having a marvelous time together. Josie and I marveled at how Archie could mix with people from all walks of life on board a cruise liner, from the wealthiest, most pretentious passengers to the humblest of crew members. He could have a laugh and a joke with everyone, often poking fun at himself. He was constantly invited to join various groups for dinner or drinks at the bar, always ready to autograph anything they asked or pose for pictures. He was especially in demand among the middle-aged divorcees on board. As soon as they discovered who he was often surrounded by women of all kinds, taking advantage of the attention he received from them. I think he was probably quite worn out by the end of the month-long cruise around the Caribbean. He certainly looked it as he staggered away from the ship when we docked back in Palma. This routine continued for 2 or 3 years after Josie and I got married, and I must admit, I loved the lifestyle. I had worked my way up to managing the cocktail bar where my wife sang most nights from 11 p.m. until 1 a.m., so I could enjoy her beautiful voice while serving the appreciative audience. The bar was on the top deck and had a lovely curved shape, providing a panoramic view of the ocean through its windows. It was a fantastic venue for Josie to showcase the music she truly loved. I was so proud every time I heard the patrons applauding her and asking for encores at the end of her set. Unlike her performances in the theater earlier in the evening, where she sang show tunes and the like, her spot in the cocktail lounge featured more bluesy, jazzy numbers by artists like Ella Fitzgerald, Dusty Springfield, and even a few by Janis Joplin if the audience was right. She always finished with one of my favorite songs, which had the audience on their feet singing along, leaving them wanting more. However, things were about to change. I vividly remember the day, December 14, 1998, when my new life was almost ruined by an overwhelming coincidence. Josie and I were leaning on the railings of the crew deck, watching the new passengers embark for the Christmas and New Year cruise to the Caribbean when a long black limousine pulled up on the dock below us. The chauffeur got out and helped the backseat passengers alight from the vehicle. An older-looking man emerged first, balding with a ring of gray hair and quite overweight, perhaps around 70, exuding an air of authority as he glared at anyone who dared to look at him from the queue of passengers. However, it was the next occupant of the limo who caused me to almost faint with shock. Getting out of the car was the woman I instantly recognized as my ex-mother-in-law. I observed her closely, noting the same blonde hair and curvy figure I had known 25 years ago. It couldn't be. She must be nearly 80 by now. Surely, she couldn't look the same as I remembered. My heart raced as the realization hit me like a thunderbolt. My ex-wife was about to board the ship where I worked. Over the years, her mother had clearly aged gracefully. The same hair, the same features. She looked great, especially from the distance we were at. My mind slowly returned to reality as I felt Josie shaking my arm. "John, what's happening, darling? You look as though you've seen a ghost or something." I felt the sweat soaking my shirt as I continued to watch my nemesis ordering the poor chauffeur around as he attempted to retrieve all their luggage from the car trunk. Nervously, I was eventually able to answer my worried wife. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I just feel a bit nauseous for some reason. I'll just go lie down for a bit. I think I'll come with you. You look terrible. Are you sure you're okay?" "No, I mean yes, I'll be fine. You stay here. I'll be fine, honestly. I almost ran to our cabin, bumping into several other crew members on the way in my haste to get away from the terrifying sight from my past. What was I going to do? The vindictive woman would obviously tell everyone who I really was when she saw my nameplate with my false identity on it. What the hell was I going to do? I could lose everything. My wife, my new life, everything I held dear. I could end up back in jail, too. All those thoughts were flying around in my head at the same time, and my brain couldn't cope. I finally staggered into our small cabin and immediately grabbed the bottle of scotch we kept there, taking several huge gulps. I gasped for air as the fiery liquid burned my throat. Slowly, I calmed down and started to think more clearly. Maybe I could avoid her. Maybe she wouldn't come into my bar. I knew she was there, but she didn't know I was, so maybe, just maybe. I lay down on the bed, my head spinning from the combination of the liquor and the panic I was feeling. I tried to concentrate, tried to think of what I could do to avoid her. Oh my God, what about Josie? Should I tell her? Definitely not. My little firebrand would undoubtedly confront her and tell her exactly what a lying, devious person she was. No, some things are best kept to myself. What would I say if I did come into contact with Claire? Should I be nice and polite to her, like the good barman I was? Or should I just ignore her and let her do her worst if that's what she wanted? Oh, what a disaster. I hated not telling Josie what was troubling me. I knew, though, that if I told her who had just boarded the ship, she would have gone ballistic. Ever since I first met her, I had always tried to tell her the truth, and now I was lying to her as I insisted it must have been something I ate that had caused me to feel ill. I couldn't think straight as I was trying to come up with any ideas as to how I could avoid my ex-wife. My mind was racing as I concentrated on the terrible consequences of Claire discovering I was using a false name and her ever finding out what I was doing on board the ship. That woman seemed to be holding my whole future in her hands once again. I protested probably a little too vehemently when my wife tried to get me to see the ship's nurse and get something to stop me from feeling ill. I knew exactly what was wrong. I just couldn't tell her. Josie had always instinctively known when something wasn't right with me. She could read me like a book when I was trying to keep something from her. Consequently, this time she was clearly suspicious about why I was refusing to go to the sick bay. She didn't push it, though. Deep down, I think she knew I would tell her when I felt the time was right. Over the next few days, I was moody and irritable with almost everyone. Not my usual self at all. I was so scared of my ex-wife seeing me that I ended up staying in our cabin as long as possible during the day and only leaving it at night to nervously do my shift behind the bar. The whole time I was working, I was as jumpy as a kitten every time the door opened and some new passengers came into the lounge. Josie had never seen me like that before. I had always been cheerful and outgoing with the customers. Now I was quiet and morose, almost to the point of being curt and impatient when I was serving their drinks. She quizzed me several times about what was wrong, reluctantly choosing to believe me when I told her everything was okay, and I was just feeling a little under the weather, that's all. Normally after my shift, I would spend an hour in the ship's gym to help me wind down and keep me fit. Jimmy, the leisure center manager, had supplied me with a key enabling me to come and go as I pleased whenever the gym was empty of passengers. It always was at 3 a.m. The passengers were usually tucked up in their cabins by that time or drunk, or often both. Working out in a sweaty gym was the last thing on their minds after a night of eating and drinking to excess. Those first few days of that fateful cruise, I never went near the gym. Instead, immediately after we had cleared up in the bar, I would get to our cabin as quickly as possible, snuggling up to my surprised wife, who was not used to me being there so soon after work. Another change in my habits that she quietly quizzed me about. We didn't even share intimate moments those first few nights either. I just wasn't in the mood as I worried about what might happen to us. Something Josie noticed but thankfully never mentioned. Days into the cruise, I had calmed down sufficiently to decide that enough was enough. I had to face my demons sometime. If she recognized me and decided to expose my secret, then I would have to face the consequences. If the powers that be then decided I should be sacked, then so be it. I had served my time for something I didn't do, and losing my job was just another consequence that my ex-wife would be responsible for. Josie knew almost everything about me anyway, and I hoped that CLA would be satisfied with just telling her who I really was and what I had been convicted of. Knowing that if she did, Josie would just laugh at her, I figured it wouldn't be a problem. I started to go out with Joss during the day as we normally did, exploring whatever island we were visiting at the time. We would go swimming and snorkeling in the warm sea from the delightful white sand beaches, a new hobby we had taken up together a couple of years prior. I loved the feeling of freedom it brought as we swam together. The sight of my wife, often in a swimsuit, never failed to inspire a wonderful sense of well-being in me as we held hands while observing all the spectacularly colored sea life of the Caribbean. It was possibly the most relaxed I had ever felt. During the days on board, I would occasionally see CLA around. I must admit I was looking out for her, hoping to spot her before she saw me. I was lucky on a couple of occasions, but managed to avoid any contact at all. She always seemed to be wrapped around her partner whenever I saw them, ignoring anything else around her as she focused all her attention on him. I could only assume he must have been extremely well off for her to be that attentive. He was nothing like the type of man she had always fancied before. Maybe he had connections or was involved in something lucrative. I didn't know. I could only speculate. I heard all about her through the ship's grapevine, which was full of staff complaining about the rude and arrogant couple who insisted on eating at the captain's table every night and never tipped the staff who served them, demanding almost exclusive attention from whichever member of the crew they decided to bully. Pretentious jerks was probably the most accurate description from one of the crew who had unfortunately crossed their paths. Gradually, I began to relax a little more as the week went on. Claire and her husband hadn't come into our cocktail bar at all while I was there, and it got to the point where I thought I might get through the whole 3-week cruise without being confronted by the woman I still despised. Then New Year's Eve happened. There had been several huge parties going on around the ship earlier in the evening, a gala dinner in the restaurant, a special show in the theater, and dancing in the ballroom at midnight for the celebrations. All the usual New Year's festivities. Things started to quiet down a little as most passengers made their way to bed, just leaving the usual diehards to carry on drinking. Luckily, Josie wasn't singing in the lounge that night. She was happily settled in our cabin after we had shared a passionate kiss to welcome the new year, out of sight of the bar patrons. My wife never lingered in the bar after her set anyway. There would always be some drunken fool who thought the beautiful singer he had been watching earlier was desperate for attention, but she preferred to retreat to our cabin to rest before I arrived. So, after a really busy night keeping our patrons supplied, I was winding down after all the earlier hectic celebrations. I was alone behind the bar, having sent the rest of the staff back to their cabins after the lounge had emptied, with just a couple of stragglers left at the tables. Just after 2 a.m., I turned to face someone who was irritatingly tapping the bar with a cabin key, ready with a look that made it clear that was not the best way to attract my attention. There she was, my ex-wife, looking straight at me with an expression of bored superiority and not a hint of recognition on her face. It was obvious she was quite drunk, slurring her words as she ordered a bottle of our best champagne to be delivered to her table. I must admit I was shaken to the core and stammered nervously as I mumbled something about bringing it over, noting that the bar was waitress service only. She showed me her cabin key, the rather ambitiously named presidential suite, and curtly told me to charge it to the room. That instruction wasn't necessary, as there were no cash transactions on board. Everything was charged to the passenger cabins throughout the cruise. I didn't mention that, though I didn't want to talk to her. I tried to just keep my head down and let her get back to her husband before she had any more chances to recognize me. I could feel myself shaking like a leaf as I prepared their champagne, putting the bottle on ice and getting ready to take it to the table, trembling with nerves but also with a deep sense of anger and unexpected indignation. 10 years together as a couple, a court case where she vindicatively lied to try to get me sent down. I hadn't changed that much, had I? A little thinner, maybe, and certainly a little gray around the temples, but I had gotten rid of the goatee, so I thought I looked much the same as I had 25 years before the last time we saw each other. And yet that horrible woman couldn't even remember the poor ex-husband whose life she had completely destroyed. I watched them surreptitiously as they drank a couple of glasses of champagne, both of them drunkenly laughing. She was embarrassingly affectionate with him, acting like a couple of teenagers. Normally, I would have politely asked them if perhaps they would be better off in their cabin, but I didn't want any more contact with her than was necessary. Thankfully, The bar was nearly empty by that time, with just a couple of late-night stragglers lingering, so their behavior wasn't an issue. Happily for my peace of mind, she and her husband didn't stay long. Maybe another half hour or so, before she dragged her drunken husband to his feet, grabbed the remaining champagne, and staggered out of the lounge. I breathed a huge sigh of relief as I watched them leave, my heart settling into its natural rhythm for the first time since they had entered the bar. I had gotten away with it. I had been worrying for nothing. Obviously, my ex-wife hadn't recognized me and had no idea who I was. I consoled myself with the thought that after a few more days at sea, the cruise would be finished, and then my worries would be over. She would be gone, out of my life completely, and Josie and I could get back to living our ordinary lives. How wrong I was. The next day, I felt like my usual happy self for the first time since I had seen her boarding the ship. I felt great. I spent quality time with my wife, lounging around in our cabin most of the day, freely talking and laughing together. Josie gasped her appreciation that I was finally feeling better. I told her I loved her dozens of times, deliriously happy to be with her once again. By the time it came for us to begin work, I was exhausted and quite hungry. The following night, they were back, relatively sober this time. At least at first. They sat and watched my wife and the band until the end of their set, politely applauding with the rest of the audience. After they had performed their last song, I felt a little more at ease than the previous night, confident that if I kept out of their way, there shouldn't be a problem with CLA recognizing me. They consumed another 2 bottles of very expensive wine, getting increasingly inebriated before they left together, noisily singing off-key. They linked arms and staggered drunkenly, once again temporarily out of my life. A short while later, I was clearing up their table, putting all the rubbish into the collecting bin. As I gathered it from where they had left it, I picked up the last dirty napkin from where they had been sitting. I noticed what looked like writing on the underside of the neatly folded piece of paper. My heart filled with dread and missed several beats as I read what had obviously been written for my attention by my vindicatively tormenting ex-wife. I know who you are. I couldn't breathe. My whole life seemed to flash before my eyes as I started to feel faint. I had to sit down in the chair previously occupied by that woman, my eyes welling up with tears. I just knew that my whole life with Josie was at stake. That would destroy me. My God, John, you look terrible. Have I to call Josie? I dimly heard someone say after I had slowly walked back behind the bar. No, I'll be fine. I just feel a little sick, that's all. I'll be okay after I've sat down for a bit. I managed to mutter to whoever it was that had asked me if I was okay. My eyes weren't focusing properly, so I had no idea which one of the staff had seen the state I was in. I sat dazed in the storeroom behind the bar, staring at the scribbled note I was holding in my shaking hand. My mind was racing in a maelstrom of emotion as I pondered how I could get out of this disaster. The internal phone ringing made me jump out of my skin as I sat there, my head in my hands, swaying back and forth and muttering to myself in frustration. I knew instinctively who it was even before I nervously picked up the handset. Hello, Sky Lounge. Hello, John. Long time no see. What do you want, Claire? Can't you just leave me alone? Shuckling. Oh, I don't think so, John. I need you to do something for me, she said with more laughter. What the hell do you want from me? You. Now, John. No need to be nasty, is there? Come to my cabin in an hour, and you'll find out. I have something for you to do. Screw off, Claire. We're finished. I don't have to listen to your stupid demands anymore. You do if you don't want all the people on board this ship to find out they have a convicted murderer in their midst. You vindictive. Can't you just leave me alone? Haven't you messed up my life enough? You know I didn't murder him. You lying cow. We know that, John. You and me, everybody else. Though they think you did. How did you turn into such a... What did I ever do to piss you off so much? An hour, John. Don't be late. My anger almost boiled over as I slammed the buzzing handset down onto its cradle. I knew this was going to happen. Why the hell did she have to pick our ship? How unlucky could I be? Slowly, I started to calm down as my heart began to beat normally. Would she really tell everyone her version of my life story if I didn't do as she had instructed? I knew the answer to that question without a doubt. Of course, she would. Just over an hour later, at almost 3 a.m. On the 2nd of January 1999, my day of destiny, as I was to discover, I found myself standing outside the door to the presidential suite. The ship's layout meant that that particular cabin was alone at the end of a long corridor, with no neighboring accommodation anywhere near it. It was exclusively private, having a larger-than-average balcony that looked out to sea at the rear of the ship and was not overlooked at all. Nothing below it apart from the ship's stern and the wash left behind by its huge propellers many feet below. I knew the layout well. Josie and I had had a few sneaky meetings there when the suite was otherwise unoccupied on a cruise, spending many hours together in that lavish setting we could never have afforded normally. Now it was as though all those marvelous memories were about to be tarnished because our wonderful secret hideaway had turned into a confrontation zone. I had deliberated the entire time I was cleaning up in the bar about whether I should do as she instructed, regretfully deciding that I didn't have a choice. Maybe I could persuade her to keep her mouth shut for once. Appeal to any semblance of decency she might have left in her nasty, vindictive mind. Deep down, though, I knew I was screwed. I hesitated for a few seconds before eventually tapping lightly on the gold-painted metal door. Surprisingly, it moved, swinging inward slightly as it reacted to my knocking. From inside, I dimly heard her voice inviting, no, instructing, me to enter. I slowly walked into the beautifully decorated sitting room to find it empty. The large double doors leading into the bedroom were both wide open, giving me a clear view of the bed where Josie and I had spent so many happy times. I could see Claire's husband sprawled across one side of it in his shirt sleeves, his trousers comically bunched around his ankles, his chest rising and falling rhythmically in time with his loud snoring. In any other circumstances, I would have had to laugh at the sight. At that moment, though, I just ignored it. "Out here, John," Claire called. I looked out onto the balcony to find Claire sitting in one of the heavily padded loungers provided for the usually important occupants of this suite. She had obviously changed her dress after coming back from the bar. Now she was wearing a black silky robe that hinted at her being unclothed underneath. "I see you still like my body, John. You always did, didn't you?" she said softly, mocking me. "What is it you want, Claire?" I asked brusquely, tearing my gaze away from her and looking into her eyes. "Sit down, John. We have a lot to talk about," she laughed, pushing a chair toward me with her foot. "No, we don't. We have nothing to talk about, so I'll ask you again. What the hell do you want?" I snapped through clenched teeth. She laughed out loud, a look of mocking disdain in her eyes. She stood and dropped the flimsy robe. Her body was illuminated by the light from the bedroom, showing just how much she looked like her mother. The feelings of disgust and hatred I felt toward her completely overridden any remnants of attraction I might have felt. She grinned at me, licking her lips like an evil predator about to pounce on its prey. "For the moment, I just want some fun," she said. "You were always good at that, John. After that, we'll have to see what I want from you." My heart sank. I didn't want anything to do with this woman. I hated her. The only person I wanted was Josie, probably snoring gently by now. I nervously glanced inside the bedroom, looking at her husband still laying prone in the same ridiculous position he had been in when I first entered their suite. "Oh, don't worry about him, John. He'll be unconscious until at least lunchtime anyway. Even if he did wake up, he'd probably just want to watch a real man with me," she laughed, mocking her sad older partner with an evil chuckle. My head was dizzy, a million thoughts swirling in my mind. Perhaps if I went along with her demands, she would leave me alone from now on. Maybe her husband would wake up and throw me out if I was lucky. But how could I betray my Josie? What had she done to deserve this? Claire climbed onto my lap, pulling my head closer as she leaned in to kiss me, pressing her lips against mine forcefully. She started tugging at my clothes, ripping my shirt open and impatiently pulling it from my shoulders. I did nothing to help her, just sitting with my hands at my sides, my fists clenched tightly enough for my nails to dig into my palms. I was getting angrier with her, hating her even more if that was possible. What right did she have to my body? She had rejected me all those years ago, and now she decided she wanted me again. Well, if it was my compliance she wanted, that's what she would get. I stood up from the chair and roughly pushed her back, dragging her to her feet and bending her over the balcony rail. I was determined she would not enjoy this. I had never considered being rough with a woman before, but now felt it was necessary. For the next few moments, I tried to assert myself, but she seemed to relish the attention. Suddenly, I knew what I had to do. I had to remove this woman from our lives for good. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed her by the back of her neck and hoisted her up, using all my strength to throw her over the handrail. Her anguished scream quickly faded into the soft wind as she fell toward the dark sea far below. Then, all was quiet. Only the gentle lapping of the water against the ship's hull disturbing the night air. I felt strangely calm. My heart slowed from its racing pace as I leaned back against the table. I had no remorse, no regrets. It's true what they say about soldiers going to war. The act of killing becomes easier the more you do it. I hadn't hesitated or felt any guilt about throwing her overboard as soon as she threatened my marriage. She had it coming. Her vindictive lies had robbed me of 20 of the most important years of my life. She had prevented me from becoming a father by lying and having me locked up. She had caused my family to become estranged from me, their shame at what they thought I had done preventing them from ever contacting me in prison. And now, to cap it all off, she had just threatened my marriage to the woman I loved more than anything in the world. No more worry and hate in my heart. Enough was enough. Calmly, I looked back into the bedroom to ensure her husband was still where I had last seen him. I knew that if he had woken up, he would have to go overboard too. Luckily for him, he was still sleeping and snoring heavily. I swiftly pulled my shirt back on, straightening my trousers and hair to ensure I looked almost exactly the same as when I entered the suite. I took one last look around to make sure nothing indicated I had ever been there. No sign of a struggle or anything out of place. I spotted a couple of shirt buttons she had ripped off lying on the floor and kicked them under the railing into the night air. Emptying the remaining champagne over the side, I placed the bottle back on the table next to the empty glass. I wiped my hand and noticed her discarded robe draped over the back of her chair. Quietly, I let myself out of the suite and gently closed the door behind me. I knew the ship like the back of my hand, so I had no problem making my way unobserved past the cameras down to mine and Josie's cabin. There, I swiftly undressed and slid into bed next to my gently snoring wife. I didn't sleep. The adrenaline still coursing through my body prevented that. Instead, I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling and listening to my wife's breathing until the sun came up. It was finally over. The figurative hit the fan just after lunch the following afternoon when a rumor began to circulate around the ship that a passenger had gone overboard the night before. Apparently, her husband had woken from a drunken stupor and discovered his wife missing, and despite appeals over the ship's tannoy, she had not reappeared. The general consensus among the crew and other passengers was that she had accidentally fallen from her balcony while she was almost incapacitated from drinking. The captain decided not to turn around and look for her. After all, we were in the middle of the Atlantic, and no one had any idea when she had actually fallen overboard. The chances of finding her alive, or even locating her body, were almost non-existent. The rest of the staff in the cocktail lounge, and I, had to make written statements to the first officer about the woman's condition when she and her husband had left the bar the night before. Apparently, that was the last place they had been before returning to their cabin. Her husband was distraught, blaming himself for getting so drunk that he couldn't look after his wonderful wife. Soon, the rumors began to circulate. They had a drunken argument, and he had pushed her off the balcony. She had been suffering from a terminal illness and decided to end it all by jumping from the ship. Her husband had been caught up in the moment, and she had accidentally fallen overboard. All these wildly inaccurate fantasies spread among the nearly 4,000 passengers and crew, none of whom had a clue about what had actually happened. Well, that wasn't strictly true. One person knew exactly what had happened to the poor woman, and I wasn't saying a word. Sadly, I wasn't able to tell the rest of the passengers that the deceased woman wasn't worth grieving over, and the mood on the ship became rather somber for the last leg of the cruise back to Majorca. All entertainment was canceled out of respect for the poor victim and her husband, which meant Josie could spend the evenings in the bar with me instead of performing. The lounge was very quiet, with just a few passengers and crew at the tables, not drinking much, no doubt all thinking there, but for the grace of God, etc. This allowed me to spend much more time than usual with my lovely wife. I wished I could tell her what had happened and how my earlier life now had the closure I had always felt it needed, but I decided it was better to keep my mouth shut and focus on our future together. We eventually docked 2 days later in Palma, where we had to give our statements once again, this time to the Spanish police. Thankfully, they concluded that the ship's captain was correct, and the incident was just a tragic accident that sometimes occurred on cruise ships when someone had partaken of too much alcohol. All in all, I couldn't have planned things better if I tried. So that's it, really. The end of my story about how I committed the perfect crime and got away with it. Did I have any guilty feelings? Not really, not at first anyway. I had served 20 years for a murder I didn't commit, and this just evened the score in my eyes. Now, almost 15 years later, I do feel a little remorse sometimes when I look back on that dark day in my life. When I consider things rationally, I tend to think that maybe I have something to thank Claire for, despite the fact she got me sent down for a huge chunk of my early adulthood. Looking at things from a glass-half-full perspective, if I hadn't been sent to prison, I would never have met my best mate and only true male friend, Archie. If I hadn't met Archie, I would never have gone to Majorca. If I hadn't gone to Majorca, I wouldn't have met the true love of my life, Josie. So, all things considered, if I had never met my ex-wife, I would not be living the happy life I live now. However, those feelings of remorse don't last long. Occasionally, when I think of Claire, I remember what the mafia says, an eye for an eye, a life for a life. She took a significant part of my life, so I've done the same to her. She changed from a lovely, pleasant girl into a nasty, vindictive woman, transforming a good, ordinary, hard-working man who loved her dearly into a cold-hearted killer. So, screw her. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.